Welcome, everybody, to LOL, where the laugh critiques itself and then laughs out loud to keep itself from crying. I am your host, Craig Pasta Jardula, along with my co host, the professor himself, Jeremy Kuzmarov. Jeremy is a professor at Tulsa Community College, but he's also the author of many books, including his new one, Warmonger. It's a story about the Clintons. Go pick it up. Professor, how you doing today?
I'm doing great.
Is that a ring light you got on over there? Do you really have a ring light?
Yes.
Because you look good here. For those out there who are listening, you can't hear it, you can't see it, but Jeremy looks good. All right, let's get rolling.
Yeah.
Listen, I remember when I was at one of the DNC conventions, and I really didn't think at that moment in time that Joe Biden had a chance. This is when 2020, when he was running for president. He was like a distant, fourth, fifth out there. He was behind Elizabeth Warren. He was behind Amy Klobuchar, Pete Buttigieg, and of course Bernie Sanders. I didn't think there was any way whatsoever he would get the top of the ticket. But there was an activist, a journalist out there kind of handing out some information, going deep in the paint of Joe Biden's policy and his history of his policy. Everything to saying, I was the guy, Jeremy, who wanted a wall before Donald Trump, right? Like the fence that he had a room full of policemen and unions that he was kind of, capitulating to for their votes. He had been for almost every single war, Iraq on the Senate floor, the crime bill, right? The bankruptcy bill. What else? The Patriot Act. There were so many. The list went on and on and on and on. But Professor, this is why it's such a treat and awesome to work with you today. You have a little story to talk about his particular mentor and maybe where he got those lovely war mongering habits from, don't you, Professor?
Yes. And I think this is not really very well known history. But yeah, and I published an article about this in Covert Action magazine. And Biden discusses this in his memoir, Promises to Keep, that his mentor was Averell Harriman. And, that may not be a household name today, but Harriman was a very significant figure in American political history. Firstly, his father, E.H. Harriman Sr., was one of the robber barons of the Gilded Age. He made a fortune in the railroads. And then Averell, the son, took over the father's business, and he set up Brown Brothers Harriman, which was one of these storied Wall Street investment firms. And, he was connected with the Bush family. George Walker Bush and Prescott Bush worked for that firm. And I think most controversially is that they, during the 1930s, one of their top clients was named Fritz Thyssen, who was basically one of Hitler's key money men. And there's evidence that, he was Brown Brothers Harriman. I mean, yeah, they did a lot of, they were basically intricately associated with American imperialistic operations overseas. Like Brown Brothers had taken over the banks in Nicaragua when the U.S. Marines had invaded Nicaragua. Brown Brothers Harriman, they had investments in like mines all around the world. So they became, they were lobbying for very hardline policies in the Cold War. Excuse me, even earlier when the United States invaded Russia after the Russian Revolution, because the Bolshevik government nationalized a lot of the industry in Russia. And then in the 30s they were they had clients who were German Nazis. So there's a very kind of dark history there. And then Harriman went into the diplomatic service during World War II, in part because he had a lot of business dealing in Russia. And the FDR administration appointed him. And then he's known as one of the fathers of the Cold War. He pushed for a hardline policy against the Soviet Union in the Truman administration. And he came to coordinate the Marshall Plan, which was a key instrument of the early Cold War. And he was a big time, at providing economic aid in Western Europe to try and build up their economy vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union and Eastern European countries were excluded from the Marshall Plan. And then he was a gung-ho supporter of NATO when it was founded in 1949. And he was a big-time supporter of the Korean and then Vietnam Wars.
So this guy had checked off all the boxes for warmonger
Yeah,
right
and he
there.
had
And
a long diplomatic career. He served from the FDR. He was in the Kennedy administration. He was the governor of New York. Now this guy is really well connected. He was like best friend with Nelson Rockefeller. He was the governor of New York in the 50s. He was a Democrat, but his biographer said his policies as governor resembled more Herbert Hoover than Franklin Roosevelt. And then he got a top diplomatic job in the Kennedy administration, and then served in the Lyndon Johnson administration, and was like a key supporter of the Vietnam War. And he was like the State Department spokesman trying to justify U.S. bombing of North Vietnam. And he was gung ho in supporting the Diem government that the U.S. had propped up as a counterweight to communism. Then later he said he was against the war, when it turned ugly, but he had been like
that's a
a
Joe Biden
propaganda
trait,
guy.
right? Joe
Yeah.
Biden would always. Joe Biden professor would say, like, I was, against the what was it when they powered up and they have another big like the press, like a full court press of sorts. They called it a surge, right? I was against the surge. No, you were for the surge before you were against it. And
Mhm.
I would play this famous clip of Joe Biden say, pushing for to get into Afghanistan and whatnot, and then later on him saying, I was one of the only ones against it. So it seems like Averell Harriman had the same as the one who taught Joe Biden, right? These traits. It says right here, Joe Biden's mentor, and this is from Covert Magazine by you, of course. Joe Biden's mentor, father of the original Cold War, was a traitor to the U.S. family company, sold fuel additive to the Nazi Air Force, right? The family company sold fuel additive to the Nazi Air Force. It seemed like that, he was one of the people on the front line pushing towards being in agitation to Russia. The same thing with Joe going on right now. Why would you call him the father of the Cold War? And also, too, why is he a traitor to the United States? Go ahead, Professor.
Well, he was a traitor because the United States went to war against Nazi Germany, and his company had investment in these companies that were selling fuel additive to the Nazi Air Force. And he may have violated the Trading with the Enemy Act. These deals may have continued after the U.S. formally went to war. And he was also, again, Fritz Thyssen was a key client who bankrolled the Hitler government and its rise to power through the 1930s. So he's bankrolling the American enemy. And then there were investigations. The State Department was investigating this. These banks that some of these Wall Street banks that had dealing with the Nazis and helped bankroll them, or as client their financiers, they were being investigated. And that's one reason they started invoking this specter of communist agents, because they wanted to divert public attention from the investigations into their treachery during World War II. They're dealing with the Nazis, and they started accusing people in the State Department of being communists, and they wanted the investigations to shift to that. Like they accused Alger Hiss, was a key figure in the Roosevelt administration in the State Department, who was involved in the Yalta agreements, which was a cooperative agreement between the United States and Soviet Union at the end of World War II. They attacked Hiss as a spy and a traitor, and it was to deflect attention from guys like Harriman, the Dulles brothers, and Prescott Bush, who were the real traitors. And then they pushed this hardline policy, and their foe was Henry Wallace. Henry Wallace was Roosevelt's vice president, who was poised to become the next president, but there was a coup at the 1944 Democratic Party convention to remove him in favor of Truman, who the Hawks could manipulate. Because James Roosevelt said later, my father stood up to the Hawks in the State Department, the anti-Russia Hawks, and Harriman was one. And Wallace was going to continue to stand up to them. He had visited Russia and he wanted cooperation. He realized Russia had been devastated in World War II, and that the Russian people did not want another war. They had lost 25 million people. Their entire infrastructure was devastated. The last thing they wanted was another war. And Wallace understood that, so he wanted a peaceful framework and a peaceful order after World War II. But then these hawks removed him, and the power broker in the Democratic Party removed him, like they removed, Bernie Sanders. They got in Truman, who was a weak guy who was tied with a Pendergast machine and didn't even have a college education. And then guys like Harriman drove the hardline policy, in the 40s, and that resulted in the creation of NATO. It resulted in U.S. intervention in the Civil War in Greece, and support of basically pro-fascist elements, and it led to the Korean and Vietnam wars.
So, geez, man, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. I
Yeah.
wonder if Averell Harriman smelt girls' necks the way Joe Biden does, and couldn't find his way off the stage at one point. But listen, let's stick right here, because you said something that's very interesting. You talked about he had a big role to play, or a role to play, with John F. Kennedy. I think a lot of people, when they think of anti-war presidents, they think of Jimmy Carter, but they don't realize how much the military industrial complex is driving the bus when it comes to foreign policy, even with guys like Jimmy Carter, right? With his actions in Afghanistan. And, I think it was Brzezinski, right? Who was one of his foreign policy advisors. What role did Averell Harriman play with John F. Kennedy?
Well, he was appointed. He was one of the so-called best and the brightest. These were the advisors around Kennedy who ultimately led the United States into the Vietnam War. There's this mystique around Kennedy because of the circumstance of his assassination, I think. But Kennedy really drove the U.S. into Vietnam and escalated the U.S. involvement. And he was a cold warrior and a hawk. And then he was assassinated. Well, he favored more of a light footprint kind of counterinsurgency approach. So there is people feel that the United States never would have gotten involved in the full-blown ground war in Vietnam if Kennedy lived. And there's some plausibility to that thesis. But Kennedy, at the same time, escalated a number of Green Berets in Vietnam and bombing operations, and a lot of them were camouflaged through the South Vietnamese Air Force. And he was a champion of counterinsurgency all around the world to stamp out wars of national liberation. And he set up a special group on counterinsurgency headed by Bobby Kennedy that was supporting counterinsurgency, military intervention, usually involving more covert operation where they trained the police and military of foreign governments to stamp out left-wing movements. And Harriman was on the special group. And Bobby said he liked him, Bobby Kennedy. He liked Averell because he was, really a gung-ho supporting counterinsurgency, and he was a hardline cold warrior. And that's who influenced Joe Biden, who look at what's going on now. Biden has escalated a new Cold War and is potentially leading us into World War III. So as you say, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Although Harriman, after he got out of government service, he kind of mellowed a little bit. And then because the Vietnam War was so unpopular, he came out and said, after he got out of the government, that he was against it, and he was favoring more détente with the Soviets, like in the 70s and 80s, and he visited the Soviet Union then. And Biden, in his early career, did favor arms control treaties, but he'd been a lot more hawkish as vice president and president. But Harriman, for most of his career, was an anti-Russia hawk. So he undoubtedly influenced Biden in his attitude toward Russia and his support for, the American century, American empire.
It's kind of what about Yugoslavia? Did obviously, there's the saber rattling and jostling with the Russian Federation, right? Or at that time, the USSR, right? At one point. But what about Yugoslavia? Did Joe have something that was whispered in his ear by Averell Harriman about Yugoslavia?
Well, yeah, and this is something Joe Biden discusses in his memoir, Promises to Keep. He discusses how when Tito was the ruler of Yugoslavia, who was a socialist, he was an independent socialist. So he didn't ally with the Soviet Union unequivocally, although he was a socialist and communist. But he forged an independent path for Yugoslavia, and he was quite a successful ruler. But the United States wanted to dominate that whole region, and Tito was out of their control. He was an independent leader, but when he died in 1980, Harriman accompanied Biden to the funeral, or I think it was a funeral maybe of one of his supporters, I forget. But they traveled there together, and Harriman, they had a discussion that Biden recounts his memoir, where Harriman said, "Well, let's plan for the future. Yugoslavia is going to be in our orbit, so, in the future." Because Tito is gone, and that presents an opportunity for us. And Biden fulfilled that opportunity when he was head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee in the 90s. He supported the dismemberment of Yugoslavia because the U.S. with Germany was supporting secessionist movements like in Croatia, to break up Yugoslavia as part of a strategy of divide and conquer. Because a single unified Yugoslav state under like a Tito type leader with independent, the U.S. couldn't control it at all. But so the U.S. strategy became, following what Harriman advised Biden, but to support secessionism, the breakup of Yugoslavia, and then the U.S. could exert influence. And they took out the last, Slobodan Milosevic was a Serb leader who was trying to keep Yugoslavia and the legacy of Tito alive. And the U.S. took him out and, bombed, targeted Serbian bombing operations. And then they carried out a color revolution against him. And after Serbia was bombed in the Kosovo intervention, and Biden, preceding his role in Iraq, was a key champion there as head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Yeah. And the U.S. acquired military base, Camp Bondsteel, a huge base in that region. So the dream of Harriman was fulfilled by Biden as head of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, of U.S. gaining influence and control in the Balkans.
So I got to say that then right now, is it safe to say that Mr. Harriman was the one who created Vladimir Putin? Because his feelings about Yugoslavia, making sure they break it up after a leader passes on. And it's so crazy because I'm thinking about what's going on in Cuba, and I'm thinking on what's going on in other countries. We saw, with Bolivia, they tried to get, Morales out of there quickly and try to get on to the next leader. And this has to be like, in the mindset of the military industrial complex. But, would you agree, quickly on a side note before I get to my last couple questions, that the bombing of Kosovo is what made the Russian federations, especially the hardliners within the government, say enough is enough with this fall down drunk Boris Yeltsin? We need to get rid of him and get somebody else in there. And they settled on Vladimir Putin, thinking that he was probably the best for that job.
Yeah, I agree with your analysis. That was a key factor in triggering the new Cold War, and breaking relation between the U.S. and Russia, because the U.S. had put in, the Clinton administration had basically really supported Boris Yeltsin to the hilt and ensured his election in 1996, and he had opened Russia up to penetration by foreign companies, and that's a key reason they liked him. But they were quite amicable U.S.-Russia relations until that was even the red line for Yeltsin, even though he's really pro-West and considered within Russia kind of lackey of the West. But that was a red line because Russia is allied with the Serbs as well, and the Serbs were targeted. And then there's the issue of NATO expansion. The Clinton administration, in violation of a pledge by Bush Senior, started expanding NATO to Russia's border in Eastern European countries, and that was another red line. Then Bush Jr. expanded it further, and Biden, is really a cold warrior in his reincarnation. I mean, he was a cold warrior in the 70s and 80s, although he did favor some mediation, arms control then. But I think he became a neoconservative in the 90s and 2000s, and kind of gung-ho supporting this confrontational policy that has led us to where we are today, where the U.S. Is directly attacking Russia, and we're in the threat of nuclear war.
Well, yeah, I mean, that's a whole nother topic for itself about what happened in Crimea the other day. And I think that Joe has been one of the biggest warmongers on even the, American left, the Democratic left. He's always pushed for NATO expansion. He's always been justified it and whatnot. Let's talk a little bit about Pamela Harriman. Who is she exactly?
Okay, yeah, it should be noted that Averell Harriman was one of the key champions of NATO when it was created. So his
Yeah.
protege continues to support NATO expansion in his tradition. And then Pamela Harriman, when they retired from the diplomat, well, Pamela Harriman came from a wealthy British family, and she married Winston Churchill's son, and then they got divorced, and she married Averell Harriman, and they became this power couple in the Democratic Party. They set up PACs to fund like right wing politicians like Biden, to basically dominate the Democratic Party, which had formerly, had more, had left wing elements. I mean, there's always been some competition between those with a more right wing economic and foreign policy philosophy and more left wing. And the Harrimans really helped tip the scale in favor of the right wing, the Clinton, the Biden, the Hawks, the corporation elements. And that's what you get when the Harrimans can give their money. I mean, Averell had a fortune, and he invested that in politicians of the ilk of Joe Biden and Bill Clinton, the new Democrats, and not the Bernie Sanders, more dovish George McGovern Democrats.
Yeah. Well, even Bernie Sanders, when you
Even
talk about,
Bernie has his
yeah,
problems, but yeah, but he's
especially when you're
doing
talking
well.
about Yugoslavia, right?
Yeah,
I
that's
mean,
true. I
God,
should
that was
mention
the
him.
one thing.
I
Like,
should
wait a
mention
second.
people more like McGovern or Frank Church or Wellstone, who are more authentic, like doves. Although, well, even Wellstone supported Yugoslavia. He disappointed a lot of liberals by supporting that. There are very few Democrats who actually opposed that policy, which was very bad for, set the groundwork for a lot of the policies we see today.
Really, to tell you the truth, I think it's a case study class. If you go back and you watch Bernie Sanders when it comes to Yugoslavia, watching him on the floor, it becomes a case study of how you distract and kind of actually virtue signal and justify and manufacture consent for bombing. We need to have conversations about this more on the floor. We need to have open dialogue, and that's it. We shouldn't be jumping to react so quickly. But I condemn what's going on over there. So go ahead and bomb them, right? Kind of like that. If you had to compare Averell Harriman to somebody in the United States government today other than Joe Biden, who would you compare him to? Just so the audience can get a grasp of who this guy is like. I mean, I got somebody in my mind right now, Professor, but you go first.
Well, again, he's like a kind of Chuck Schumer, Obama, Biden type. I mean, he is a Democrat. He professes to be more for the working people, but look, he comes from the top 1%. And so, how compassionate is he really for the poor? And then, as far as the domestic program, when push came to shove, like when he was governor, he was really more conservative. His biographer says his policies resembled Herbert Hoover, not Franklin Roosevelt. And then he was an imperialist at his core. I mean, sometimes he may have opposed certain excesses, like in Vietnam. Eventually, he came to oppose like Nixon's bombing of North Vietnam. Killed so many civilians. But he favored the U.S. intervention in Vietnam to try and create an anti-communist alternative. He may have questioned some of the tactics, but he favored the U.S. empire, and he was a believer in the American century, and he was an ardent anti-communist. So there are a lot. I mean, most people in the Democrats are like him.
Yeah.
Uh,
It's funny because he reminds me a lot of John Kirby and Antony Blinken. As I'm listening to the stories you're telling me here, where he always seems to have like, oh, we have compassion for the poor, we have compassion for those out there. It's like the fake tears that you saw from Kirby when he, starts to cry about, Palestinian children being bombed and Palestinian women being bombed, but yet he's still providing a pipeline of weapons to go directly to Netanyahu's government. We got about 50 seconds left. Finish it on off,
well, and the
Professor.
point I would make is that look, Harriman funded the party, and the Harrimans they've shaped the party so much into what it is today in their image of these elitist one percenters uh, who masquerade as being compassionate for the working class or poor, but come from that top strata, and they're ardent imperialists, and they have financial interests in sustaining U.S. empire overseas.
Yeah, that's it, guys. You hit it. That's the guy, Averell Harriman. Look at him. Joe Biden's mentor. I am Craig Pasta Jardula. That was the professor bringing the lesson for today. This is, you're listening to WBAI. This is LOL, where the left critiques itself and laughs out loud to keep itself from crying. I am your host, Craig Pasta Jardula. We'll see you later.